Mike Netzer, thank you so much for joining me today. Super excited to chat with you. And Mike, you are the Vice President of Sales at Data Center Hawk, helps people make better data center real estate decisions. And
Yep.
we'll dive deeper into like what that means and what you guys do. And to give some context around this conversation, the reason why I wanted to have it was data centers. I've been doing some research, being involved in the metaverse ecosystem, and realized that data centers power basically our modern society. And in my opinion, will become even more important going forward in our future as the future becomes more digital. And I discovered your podcast actually, which is called the Data Center Hawk podcast. And it's really, you guys have everything from like the high level, like what are data centers, to really nitty gritty, detailed topics around data centers. And I was like, okay, well, got to have Mike on board. I want to talk to him and learn all about data centers and really have like a one-on-one conversation, not only for myself, but for other listeners that don't really understand about data centers. So that is the context of this conversation. And before digging, deeper into data centers and all that, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I joined Data Center Hawk about 4 years ago, almost exactly. And before that, I had no experience with data centers. And obviously, you'll find that with a lot of people in the space. And part of the reality of it being a somewhat unknown industry for a lot of people is that a lot of people who were in it didn't know what it was before they got in it. It was the case for me. So in the last 4 years, it's been a pretty wild ride, as we'll talk about in a few minutes about what's happened in the industry. And so I feel pretty lucky to have joined when I did. I think people who joined 1 or 2 years ago, up to 10 years ago, probably feel that way too, given what's going on. But a lot of changes happening. And again, that's how I got into the space. Again, I had prior relationship with David Liggett, the founder of Data Center Hawk. And he asked me to join firm back in February of 2019. And it's been a great ride, just from working at a small company where previously had worked at bigger companies, and working with a guy I'd liked and known before joining the company. It's been really fun. So excited to talk about the space with you.
Amazing. All right. So can you describe like what is Data Center Hawk and what exactly do you guys do?
Yeah, so we're a platform that tracks the real estate side of data center industry. And so to put that into context, like there's groups that talk about how many servers are in the data centers, or what kind of servers they are, what kind of market share does NVIDIA have versus Dell versus HP. That's not us. We're focused on the real estate. So where are the physical buildings? How big are they? What's their occupancy or vacancy rate? Who's building? Who's bought land to build data centers in the future? And then on the flip side of that, where are the biggest customers in the space? So I'll give you a $10 word here, oligopsony, which is a big way of saying there's an industry in which there's a small number of buyers versus like a monopoly is where one person is the seller and they can kind of do what they want with pricing. And oligopsony is what's in the data center space, where there's 4 or 5 really big buyers, and they really dictate the terms of the market. So we have spent a lot of time kind of tracking what those groups are doing. They will build their own data centers. They will also lease significant amounts of data center space from like data center operators, like multi-tenant or co-location data center operators. So that's a big focus of the platform. And so really helping people make better decisions around, am I looking to invest in a data center? Am I looking to build one myself? Am I looking to buy land to develop a data center? Am I a big customer and I want to lease data center space? Like what's a good price to pay, or what's kind of market pricing rates and vacancy, and where do we think it's going in the future? So that's really the story we're trying to tell. So if you kind of go back to the founding of Data Center Hawk 2014, David was doing data center real estate brokerage with CBRE, and there's plenty of products out there for office real estate, industrial, retail, multifamily, as far as everything I just described, like buildings, where they're at, how vacant they are, et cetera, lease rates, but there wasn't anything for data centers. And so that's why he started Data Center Hawk, to kind of fill that space, that void for data centers, for data center professionals. And so that is what we are today. We're an online platform. We do a little bit of custom consulting work off platform, but the majority of our business is people subscribe to our site. They can come in and access our analytics. They can search data centers, everything I just described.
Who are the people that are subscribing? Are these like people like me who are intrigued, or are these like, large corporations that have billions of dollars to potentially develop data centers?
Yeah, primarily the latter. So our customer breakdown is primarily the data center operators. So all of the large groups use our site, and brokers who are doing, again, what our founder used to do. We use it in the same way they would like a CoStar or like a Real Capital Analytics or any of those sites, if you're familiar with them. And then investors are a big and growing customer group for us, as when the pandemic hit and a lot of other commercial real estate asset classes, tanked or dipped for a couple of years, data centers and industrial were really the two that had any positive growth from 2020 to 2022. So that garnered a lot of interest from the investor class to say, hey, how do we get a piece of this? And you got to see, with interest rates so low, there was just so much money out there that those are probably the three groups that use. There's some other kind of smaller groups, but it's mainly groups who are very active doing work in the space.
All right. So I want to dig way deeper into like everything that you guys are doing specifically. But before, I want to get like the high level 101. So like, what is a data center? How do you describe it to someone who pretend you're talking to your grandmother? Like, how do you describe like, hey, this is what a data center is?
Yeah, there's a couple of analogies that I think work well. So one is, if you just think of your computer, a data center is just a very, very large computer in that it has a couple of things. It has storage, so like a hard drive where just information is stored. It has a processor where it's, doing calculations or computations, whatever. And then it, most of the time, connects to the internet. So it sends information, receives information back and forth. So a data center is going to have all three of those components. It's going to have, thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of servers, which are basically like a computer without a screen for your listeners that maybe don't know what a server is. And a lot of those servers will just be storing information. A lot of those servers will be computing information. So if you like go on Google Maps and you say, I want to know how long it's going to take me to drive to Atlanta, which I did last week, looks at the data that it has, it calculates the route, and then it gets that information back to you. So that's all done, powered via a data center. So another way so that's again, huge buildings that store all that information. The tagline that we'll use is where the internet lives, which sounds a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's really true. If you go and watch a Netflix video or a Facebook post, or you log into the IRS website, like all of that goes back to a data center. And so these buildings, they're, huge and only getting bigger. The industry has grown. It's gone from maybe a 5 megawatt building to a 10 megawatt building to a 60 to 100 megawatt building. And I'll explain what that means in a second, but they're massive, highly secure, really to be built so that there is, basically zero interruption, what the groups in the industry call uptime. And so you'll see facilities that advertise a 100% uptime. Hard to actually guarantee that. Now, we certainly see that in practice. Most facilities don't ever go down, but most groups will call it 4 nines or 5 nines. So 99.9999% uptime. So it's saying over the course of a year, you'll have 10 or 12 minutes of downtime, or maybe even less than that. So Real quick, this is not super important probably for the general listener, but these companies will have, if you think of your house, you've got a power line that comes in and then it powers your house. And if the power line goes down, you're kind of screwed. Data centers usually have 2 feeds in, so they have redundant power feeds, and then they have generators. Power feeds ever go down, they have generators that kick on automatically. And then in the 20 to 30 milliseconds it takes for the generators to fire up the big battery packs that power the data center. Because back when it was desktop computer, if you unplugged even for a millisecond, or if the power just flickered in your house, everything shut down. Now, new laptops, obviously, you can just unplug the power cord and keep doing what you're doing. That's probably more equivalent to a data center. It's got that battery power, so you can keep working uninterrupted. So if you hear, most people's probably familiarity with data centers, every couple of years, you'll see a CNN article or an MSNBC article about Facebook's data center went down or Amazon's data center went down. And if the costs for those outages measured in whatever it is, advertising revenue or e-commerce revenue is in the millions of dollars an hour. And everyone freaks out when that happens, but that's why these things are so critical. Or, talk about self-driving cars, or with the outage a couple of weeks ago with the air traffic controllers. I don't know if that was specifically related to a data center, but there's some highly critical applications that depend on this. So any downtime at all is, highly undesirable. So they're built with all these different protections to make sure that they never go down.
Amazing. Okay. So you mentioned 3 parts of a data center, I guess. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but storage, compute, network. And Is there one data center for storage, one for compute, one for network, and then some do all 3, or do they specialize? How does that work?
No, that's a great question. And so if you look at what some of the largest groups have done historically, and most people are actually familiar with these, there's a massive Google data center in Iowa. Right on the Nebraska border. There's a massive Microsoft data center in Iowa as well, I believe. And so those, I think, are more typically like the storage, like these massive storage mechanisms. They may be doing some compute. They're kind of massaging the data, but they're not servicing their customers from that central location because it's so far from the users. There's obviously not a ton of population base in those Midwestern states. So typically what you'll see is kind of like core data centers, which are kind of in big population centers, which will house a lot of the information needs to service those big population centers. And there's some exceptions to this, but then you'll hear the term edge. Well, they'll push out like more like a subset of the data that's in the core to the edge, and where some computations are done, let's say closer to the user. And so one of the big, I guess, decision points in data center decision making is what's called latency. So how long it takes the information to get from the data center to the user, typically a phone or a computer. And so if you have your Google and you have a ton of information in Des Moines, Iowa, well, you're going to push out some of that information to Dallas and Washington, D.C. and LA and New York, so that the information that is needed quickly can be accessed quickly from those locations. And then they'll have kind of the central repository more centrally. So you'll see almost like this hub and spoke model, both in a city and also in like a region where data is allocated or aggregated in larger data centers, and it's pushed out to these, call them edge data centers. So they can be, if a core data center is 30 megawatts, the edge may be 2 to 4. And so it's like real hyper targeted specific information to be pushed out to those users. Yeah, not glitchy.
So I'm in Chicago. So if I Google something, and this is a random example, I Google something, maybe the compute happens in Chicago, but the storage of the info is in Iowa. Is that like how it would work, or could it all be under one location?
I think, and this is honestly even going a little bit beyond the purview, because we don't necessarily care for the services we deliver what's in the data center. It's really more about the data center, but I'll do my best to answer that question. I certainly think they push out a lot of the actual content to the regions and the hubs. And even the spokes. Then like, I would think like, for the example you provided, like your Google Maps search history, or your internet search history, or your Facebook activity history, those types of logs that are probably not hypercritical to day-to-day functioning, those are probably more the things that are going to be put in those large central repositories. Whereas things like a Google Maps example we talked about, that's probably more, I would think, pushed out so that it's retrievable really quickly. Like, so for your example, how long do you wait on a web page before you move off if you're getting the spinny wheel? For most people, it's just a few seconds. And so These companies are really smart. They know they're really good at predicting what content people want and making sure that it's available very quickly. And in those cases, typically it's going to be pushed out to the markets versus housed somewhere centrally.
And you keep referring to the data centers as like, you said, like this has this many watts, or I forget the exact terminology, gigawatts or something like that. And so does that denote size? And also like, why are these located in like middle of nowhere, Iowa? Is there like a power source there that is cheap to use the power of this stuff, or like why is that?
Yeah. So you touched on two like really important points. One is how the data center is measured, and two is like how companies decide where to put their capacity. So there certainly is a square footage component, but when companies lease from a data center, they're leasing access to, you can think of it in the most simplest terms, power, space, and cooling is what it's called. So that's a piece I didn't mention earlier, but these servers generate a ton of heat. And so not only do they take a ton of power to power them, but you have to have additional power to cool them. So a typical rental or a lease agreement for a data center would be, I need 500 kilowatts of energy, and then you're renting it on a rental rate, say it's $115 per kilowatt per month. And then on top of that, you'll pay for the actual electricity you use. And so that's how they're structured. There is some loose correlations between megawatts and square footage, like roughly 1 megawatt to 10,000 square feet is how you can think of it. But all of the industry terms, capacity in megawatts. And so the square footage isn't really important. There is a component to it, but it's more, and there's some relatively, again, most companies have, if they have a certain megawatt deployment, it'll have a roughly equivalent square footage plan. And the companies will design, you can't put too much more power into a space. So for example, if you build a data center, it's got the power coming in, the feeds we talked about, it's got the generators, all to support a certain amount of, servers. And so even if you wanted to, ramp it up and get really dense or put in these super high capacity power servers, you would have to almost re-engineer the building in order to do that. So companies design and build their data centers, and they work very closely with their customers to make sure they're delivering something that the customer actually needs. And so that's why we say, if you look at our website, you can see, everything is measured in megawatts as far as the capacity of a market or the growth of a market. The second thing you talked about is like why companies choose to put their data centers in certain places. So, a lot of those big deployments in the Midwest were really early on deployments in the space. And those sites are still growing, but they're also growing really nationwide and really globally. So quick primer on the North American data center market. So Northern Virginia, which is a group a region not a ton of people are super familiar with. It's the largest data center market in the world by about a factor of, depending on how you measure it, probably 3 or 4 in the entire world. And so the way we measure that, and again, talking back to your types of data centers question. So I mentioned kind of co-location data centers. So those are groups that build data centers in order to lease them to other groups. Think of building an office building that you're going to lease to, a number of companies. The second type, and really more how the data center industry was born, was a company, a bank, a hospital, anybody. They typically would have, a 10-story building, and maybe half of one floor had a bunch of servers in it and had a couple extra air conditioners and had a couple extra locks on the doors. Those grew over time as, technology increased and the needs of these companies. Banks built apps and they did online banking, and hospitals started putting records online. So they started building, kind of separate building data centers. And over time, those honestly became like just too expensive. And you got to think of the general trend of outsourcing across all businesses that came to IT infrastructure as well. So they outsourced those to co-location centers. So you have enterprise, which is really a declining. If you were to look at it as a share of all data centers, it's really declining. Most companies aren't building their own data centers anymore. They're leasing. Co-location, who are doing the leasing. Enterprise, which is mostly a decline. And then the third one is really hyperscale. And so the largest, call it 10 companies who are by data center footprint. So like I mentioned, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, IBM, Oracle, Twitter, LinkedIn, Uber, Dropbox. Those companies lease a significant amount of data center space. They also build their own. So technically, a hyperscale data center is an enterprise data center. It's just a company that builds and owns and operates their own data center. But the scale that they're doing it on is vastly. It's a totally different category than even like a Bank of America or Kaiser or KPMG or not KPMG, Kaiser, like large hospital who may have a large data center footprint, but it's not even close to Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook. So those are kind of the 3 data centers. So the real interplay is between the hyperscale and the co-location groups. We call them colo. The demand for those, if you look at, if you read like an Amazon earnings report there or a Microsoft earnings report, for a number of years, their cloud services business, like the Amazon Web Services or the Microsoft Azure or the Google Cloud Platform, these products were growing at 30-40% a year. And so you think about the data center space that's needed to support those. That's really the elephant in the data center room is, what are these groups doing? The amount that Facebook has grown, adding, to your point, the metaverse earlier, and the amount of data center space they added in 2022, or at least announced plans for to support the metaverse. We don't see that slowing. I would say it is possible, and we've said this on a podcast, that there is a slight slowdown, 23 versus 22. But for example, the North American data center space grew 36% in 2022, 22% the year before, 18% the year before. So it's growing a ton. And we see the same thing overseas, maybe not to the exact same extent. So the interplay between the hyperscale, those large, again, 5 users, the oligopsony, and the colo providers that are servicing them is really, I would say, the driving force within the space today.
Right. This is going to be maybe like either it's such an easy question that it could be hard. Like what is the cloud, and what has the cloud done to the data center space?
No, that's 100% great question. So those groups I mentioned, Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, those 3 groups, those are called cloud service providers. And there's other ones, IBM SoftLayer, OVH Cloud. There's some groups in Asia that are doing similar things. So a cloud is just a data center that is publicly accessible. And so you'll see when groups talk about putting their data center in the cloud. So this is the value proposition. You have a data center that you spend $30 million to build, and it was, let's call it 3 megawatts, 10 million a megawatt, and you're paying all the basically OpEx to service that, to pay the power, to pay the IT techs to service that. And if you want to add more capacity, if you want to add another 3 megawatts, it's another $30 million of CapEx plus the OpEx ongoing. So, or you could basically migrate that to Amazon. And the value of that is you basically say, we have 3 megawatts now. We think we may grow to 4 and then 5. What's really like a pay as you go. It's nearly infinitely scalable. They have a ton of hardware and software products you can basically use to match with your app or your database or your application. And so it's really the CapEx versus OpEx model. And we've seen groups migrate, and grow their presence in the cloud a ton. So all of those cloud products, when you put your data in the cloud, it's just going to an Amazon data center. And but you may not be, there's various tiers where you don't specify the specific server, or there are tiers where you do specify the specific server that your data is housed on. Again, nearly infinite tiers of security and scalability and services that you can add onto that. So yeah, not a stupid question at all. But yeah, the cloud is typically, it's just a data center, but it's not like your data center, it's leased. And again, groups will say, we need to service this application out of kind of the way that Amazon and all these groups divide up their cloud services by region. So you have like a US West 1, a US West 2, US East. And below those are like subregions to get more and more specific. But some groups have very specific requirements where we need to service this, app out of this region because it has a very high very low latency requirement. So it needs to be less than 10 milliseconds or less than 5 milliseconds, or ULL, ultra low latency, like can be like down to the 2 to 3 milliseconds range. So certain apps, again, it's a little bit beyond my scope, but I know there are requirements out there that say, hey, we have to be really, really close. And that's one of the reasons why Northern Virginia has grown so much, because, it's a fascinating history, but the history of the Northern Virginia data center market kind of goes back to the early 90s with like AOL's headquarters were there in Northern Virginia. And then that kind of coupled with all of the governmental groups that were there, who, in order to have a redundancy for anything that was in DC, put data centers in Northern Virginia. Data centers just beget more data centers, where once there's a group of data centers in one spot and there's a bunch of data there, if you're a company that, for example, one of your clients has a lot of their data in Amazon's cloud, well, you want to be right there so you can connect to it quickly. And there's a cost to that transport. So that's why you've seen Northern Virginia just mushroom, and other groups, other markets that have had some success, it continues to explode.
So, and you mentioned that companies, I think you called it enterprise, I believe, companies that are actually building out their own data centers, is there any growth there, or is that just decreasing and everyone's going cloud pretty much?
I would say it's majority, if not exclusively, decreasing. We see very, very few companies building their own data centers, and they're either going one of two things. They're putting some of their stuff in the cloud and some of their stuff in a co-location facility. And there's various reasons for that, be it security or, like financial companies or healthcare companies will say like, you need to have like in there, like whatever it is, SOC 1 or ISO 9000, whatever it is, certification. They would say, hey, your data needs to be on a physical server that you own. And so for those types of things, they would put some of that in a co-location facility with maybe a locked cage. And then the rest goes in the cloud, where you don't specify what physical server it is on. You just know it's in the cloud. Yes, very few companies building their own data centers. It's going split into cloud and colo.
How much of the, I guess, internet or web is powered by data centers?
I mean, I think it's like 99.9%. I mean, nearly all websites have to be housed on a server. Now, if you're saying like data center versus
like the enterprise, like the actual company's hosting.
Oh, yeah. Probably 80 to 90% data center. Wow. And then, 10 to 20% out of enterprise. And again, a lot of those enterprises, they're not public internet. So if those stats I just referenced would be like total capacity, if you're looking at actual like www.internet, it's probably 90 plus out of a data center.
Wow. Okay. And you mentioned something called hyperscale. And what is hyperscale? And I guess like, what are the other scales?
Really, hyperscale is the only scale. And it just refers to, again, like those 5 to 10 of the largest customers. Again, these are groups that both build their own data centers and lease their own data centers, or they lease data from co-location operators. So those groups will account for, anywhere from 60 to 90% of all activity, depending on the quarter. That can vary, it can go up and down. But so those groups, it's really 5 to 10 customers that are really buying everything in the space. So you can imagine what kind of, pressure these groups put themselves under to deliver a product that meets these companies, both their timeline, their location, and their pricing, to meet all of those things for those big companies. So those groups are referred to as hyperscale. And you may get a different definition or a different list depending on who you ask, but there'd be pretty broad agreement on, again, the top 5 to 10 as far as who these groups are.
And this is kind of a separate topic a little bit, but is it problematic that there's just a handful of companies that are really driving this push towards cloud? Like, I guess a few players, I guess there's more efficiencies with that scale, but I don't know. Is there any issues relating to like, I don't know, security or something like that, if there's only a few players?
Yeah, I think these groups have done a pretty good job at, building something that meets the needs of their customers. In the cases that I mentioned where it can't, it's really driven by some larger, compliance that they've got to have, like again, financial and healthcare companies. So I think, from an antitrust standpoint, certainly having three big cloud players I think would give me some assurances. And there's groups that are rising to the challenge, like some of those kind of tier two, that's a rough term that I use, tier two cloud, like again, Oracle, IBM are certainly knocking on the door as far as growth. Like those OVH cloud, and there's some regional players. There's some groups that build, maybe service just one or two markets that deliver a cloud-like platform. So there are options out there. It's really more like on the pricing side and the development side. Those groups, they really held a lot of power up until probably a year ago, as far as setting the terms of leasing and development. So it's really an interesting dynamic. Now that power started to shift as, there's really just a lot of, that's probably another dynamic worth discussing, is like power is getting harder to come by, land is getting harder to come by in some of these really key markets. And in addition to that, there's a lot of pressure on these companies to deliver power sustainably. And if you think about, a 50 megawatt data center, I don't remember the exact stat, but I think a megawatt is X number of homes. There's a, rough math. I think it's in the hundreds. So you think a 50 megawatt data center is maybe several thousands of homes worth of power. And so when you're, when the Northern Virginia data center market is growing by hundreds of megawatts per year, you can see where that type of power consumption is going to get noticed. And so again, there's a lot of pressure on these groups to develop green, both internally from their own shareholders versus from their customers, are saying, hey, we want a data center that's powered, sustainably. So there's a lot of pressure. But again, you heard the growth statistics, 30% growth, 35% growth in last year in 2022. So kind of you have a lot of pressure building up in the industry. And what that does is, it will drive demand from Northern Virginia into Dallas, into Atlanta, into Chicago. It'll drive stuff out of Northern California into Salt Lake and Reno and Denver and Phoenix. So it's still an industry very much that is maturing with regards to figuring out how to navigate all those things.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the land and the power. Land is shocking to me just because it's like, America is pretty large, overall, and there's a lot of empty space. Are you talking about because it has to be like, near New York City or near Dallas or whatnot? Mm-hmm. And then in terms of the power, I always think about whenever you're talking about this power and these data centers, I keep going back to like Bitcoin miners and crypto miners, mm-hmm. where usually they're located by like some sort of, river that has a power plant, or like a oil and gas field, like in Texas, where they're using like the excess flare gas to power some miners. Yeah. Tell me about this dynamic of like, hey, we're running out of land and, everything's very power hungry. So they're trying to go more renewable.
It really is land that's very close to the existing data centers. And so, if you look at Northern Virginia, where, 10 years ago, you could have got land for maybe a couple $100,000 an acre. That would be considered prime location. Now that's $4+ million an acre. And again, that's really driven by some of that latency that I talked about earlier. So a kind of a shock value stat for you is there's a crossroads in Northern Virginia, in Ashburn. It's called the heart of the internet. And it's estimated that 70% of the world's internet traffic travels through that intersection there. And so being very close to that is highly valuable. And again, there is only so much land. And so as you get further out, instead of, there being an additional cost for land, there's an additional cost to get the data in and out, and you kind of pay that transport tax, as it were, in the form of latency. So that's one of the reasons land is driven up. It's really just not that we're running out of land, but the land that's really prime. So you're starting to see companies will buy office developments and knock them down, or repurpose industrial land.
Is that location of the land, is that dependent on where the literal fiber optic cables are like laid, or what is determining that, but just besides being close to all the other data centers?
Yeah, it really is. So it's proximity to existing data centers, it's proximity to fiber, because there's a cost to run fiber. I think, maybe 10 to 20K per mile. I could be wrong. It could be 50K, but it's in that range. Proximity to existing power. So in a market like Northern Virginia, that's not really a concern, because all the current power is spoken for. So it's really conversations with the power operators about how quickly can you get power to a site. But there's an interesting group that's doing some work up there called Quantum Loophole. So they bought a big parcel of land about, 40 miles, 20 miles. It's 20 miles north of the heart of Ashburn. And they're spending all this money to run this huge, what they call a fiber ring, up to Frederick, Maryland, and back down. So it's going to be highly connected to the heart of the internet, to Ashburn, but up in a place where the power and the land were much cheaper. I think it was like, I don't remember the exact value, maybe in the $100,000 or $40,000 an acre versus the millions of dollars per acre. So they traded a land cost for the money they had to put in to build that fiber ring. So there's companies that are getting creative. There's, the other trend we're seeing is groups kind of moving to where the power exists. So existing data, or existing power plants, can we attract data centers to be near us? Just like you mentioned with the crypto, there's typically some latency challenges with doing that, but it is something that people are looking at more than they used to be. Yeah, it's important, I think, to note like the crypto. We had a lot of people reach out to us from a crypto standpoint probably 2 years ago. That tapered off a little bit, I think, coincident with the price of Bitcoin or crypto.
Tapered a bit or tapered a lot? I would
tapered
imagine
a lot.
Tapered a lot. Yeah.
But those groups typically, they don't need a full-blown data center. We heard stories of people running Bitcoin mining operations out of like a shipping container. As long as they have the power, there's a blip or a slight interruption in the power supply, it's not catastrophic for those groups. Everything turns back on, and you've lost, if you go down for 10 minutes, you've lost, 10 minutes of the day. Whereas for an e-commerce site, it can be much more costly. So we had a lot of groups reach out. It wasn't always a good fit because, again, they're not looking for a data center. They're not looking for the information we provide. They're looking for a lot of power, a big old building, and a place to put some servers. And so, and a lot of traditional data center operators, they really shied away from Bitcoin mining operations because these groups were for a long time kind of fly by night, where they'd show up, they'd sign a huge lease, and then 6 months later they'd just move out, leave all their stuff. And so there was this kind of tentative approach between the data center industry and the crypto industry as far as putting workloads. I mean, you still don't see a ton of crypto workloads in traditional data centers, but they're kind of dancing with each other. They may be vying for the same land, they may be vying for the same power, but they're not truly customers of one another.
Yeah, the power aspect of data centers. I guess I get people were angry or have been angry in the past, I guess not so much anymore, that crypto was using a lot of power for the mining of cryptocurrency because they're like, it doesn't make any sense. It just mine this crypto. Of course, there's arguments on both sides. But then for this, I couldn't imagine people are that angry for power hungry data centers just because data centers are powering like the internet and like everything that we're using. But you did mention that they're trying to go more green and more renewable. Does that make sense in a world where like you're mentioning these growth rates of like 30% like per year, which is outrageous. So like you can't compete with fossil fuels and like renewables can't compete with that type of growth. So what are people in the data center world doing to I guess go more energy friendly?
They're really doing everything. I would say, just to take one step back on that question, like where you've seen community push back against the data centers, they're really not pushing back. I guess individuals are not pushing back on the power usage because it doesn't affect them. As long as you've got power to your house, it's not like when a data center goes next door, it sucks all the power up and you're having outages. I mean, they've figured that piece out at least. They're really, they're pushing back on the way they look. They're typically big, not extremely aesthetically pleasing buildings. That's changing. Another thing they have to do is like they have to run their generators periodically to test them. And that generates a little bit of noise pollution. So they've had to do some mitigation there. So the community pushback is not on the power side. It's really the corporate pushback. So large customers leasing from the data center are pushing that. And again, their own shareholders are pushing that. And you're absolutely right. If the data center industry never grew another megawatt, it would take a number of years to, replace the current fossil fuel setup with some type of sustainable. Now, that's not to stop them from trying, and groups are taking all number of approaches versus, kind of the lowest level is where you can kind of do like the carbon offset, purchasing those offset credits versus helping to fund a wind farm or a solar farm or, some type of storage facility so that you can kind of smooth out the peaks and valleys of wind and solar. So these groups are really kind of looking at every approach. And I would say you can look at the stats and maybe be a little bit discouraged about the amount of work that's to be done. But, all of these groups, I think, are working pretty hard in earnest they've all set targets. All these large groups have set targets to be, 100% carbon neutral or green, or you really have to dig into what those definitions mean. To be honest, is like, are they're replacing? Are they truly not, generating any carbon? Is every, light switch they turn on at Google powered directly from some green energy source, or is it offset, or is it some other way? So there's really a big push now to just agree on the terms. And so there's been a number of kind of para-industry groups that have said, hey, let's try and build a coalition, set the terms. And then once we've all agreed to the terms, we can set some targets to help get there. It is one of the big pressures on the industry to do that. But again, you don't see it slowing any of the actual development and growth that's happening. I'm not saying they're being hypocritical or talking out of both sides of their mouth, but there's still businesses to be run. And so they're going to do everything they can to be sustainable, but they're also, not going to turn down a 100 megawatt lease if it comes to them.
Yeah, I don't know. The whole ESG movement, I think, has been proven to be a little bit of a scam, like not a scam, but just kind of like a distraction. I've even seen, I think it was Blackstone or BlackRock, I forget, but even they're saying, hey, we're not really focusing so much on ESG anymore. It's kind of not relevant to our business, which I think ESG made much more sense in a world of low rate environment where the rates were minimal, and now that rates are going up and business is just harder in general. I feel like people are like, ESG is like, we can focus on that later. Anyway, kind of what I'm seeing, but maybe data centers, it's a little bit different.
No, I think that it's certainly one of those things that gets a real critical look when things get a little tight. And again, we haven't seen people certainly abandon any of those plans, but it makes it a lot harder to have, to live up to a green commitment in the face of growth, a tightening economic environment, all of the above. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I don't envy these guys that some of the work they've got to do to get there.
All right. I want to talk to you about the impact of AI on data centers, just because I know that AI has been like the hot thing for the past year. And my understanding of OpenAI and their partnership with Microsoft was OpenAI really wanted to partner with one of these big, I guess, cloud providers because AI is so hungry for compute and storage and whatever. And they chose Microsoft because I think they're one of the big five. How do you guys think about that going forward? Because AI now is like going to be everything. Therefore, how do you guys position, or what do you guys think is going to happen to the market broadly?
Yeah, so I would say from where we're sitting, we see, AI is more something that is going to either sustain or accelerate the growth of the cloud service providers. So what we've already seen for the last 5 years is, like you said, 30 to 40% growth in AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform. That's, in my mind, one of their next products that's going to continue their growth. So I would think from our standpoint, that's continued growth from those groups. Potentially, it lifts up some of those tier 2 groups that either have a competing product or have some product that interfaces with one of the larger cloud service providers. So you can kind of do a hybrid cloud or multi-cloud strategy. So I don't know that it will be a directional shift in the industry. I think it will be a magnitude shift that it will either fuel additional growth, or if those groups, you kind of heard rumblings of, hey, AWS is going from 40% growth to 35. Maybe that the implementation of those new AI products keeps their growth higher. Again, tracking like the individual applications that AI is working on, a little bit outside of our group's purview, but yeah, we certainly see it as something that will be, again, the amount of resources it needs, it will be, at least we hope, a continued driver of growth in space.
When you guys are looking towards the future of data center growth, is there some sort of growth plateau that you're like, oh man, once, I don't know, like there's 60% of the world's online now. When we get to 95%, like our growth is going to kind of stop, or like the growth of data centers will roughly stop? Or is that not the case? I assume it's not the case, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, there was, I think in 2018, there was a study, I think it was a Cisco or IBM. It basically said, like, remember the stat, it was either 50% of the world's data had been created in the last 2 years. Don't quote me on that specific stat, but it was something along those lines. It was shocking, an extremely high number. And if you look at you can Google this, just like growth of the internet or growth of whatever, all of those stats would point to the fact that no, we're only generating more and more and more data, and our demand and appetite is only getting higher and higher for what we expect. I used to have, emojis on my phone. Then I had GIFs. Now I want 4K video. Now I want an immersive HD experience. Now I want VR, all on my phone or at home. And so this kind of secular demand we see is just continuing to grow. And once again, we're not experts on the growth of the internet. We see kind of the results of it, but you certainly see that demand continue. And again, I think personal experience would tell us, like, yeah, that's absolutely growing. Like when I go home, maybe I watch a TV show with my wife. I got 3 boys. They're all on switches streaming. My daughter's on an iPad, and not to mention we've got a Nest and everything else that's just chewing up data. So, if you told me 5 years ago that 600 megabits download for my house wouldn't be enough, I'd have laughed at you. And now we're like, kids are complaining to me that it's glitching. So again, that's just a kind of personal anecdote overlay that we certainly see the demand increasing. Now, how that plays out is, we believe, is you'll see continued spread, within regions. So you see, again, Dallas, Phoenix, Chicago, Northern California, those markets were top 5 markets, but have seen significant growth in the last 2 years. And then you've seen the emergence of markets like Portland, Denver, Minneapolis, Austin, Houston. So you'll see the continued spread, and that's true on the global scale as well. So you see groups that are well established in North America then go establish a European footprint and an Asian footprint, now a Latin American footprint. Eventually that's going to happen in Africa too. And so there is so much, unrecognized or untapped potential to grow the space. So that's going to take a while to happen globally. But I think you're not going to see, I don't think, anything really plateau. If you were to look at the global data center market, I would say expect no plateau or trail off, anytime soon, just because, again, what happens when, India and China already developed, technologically advanced countries, but they get to a saturation point where the US is at, where everybody's got a smartphone, everybody's got a high definition TV. And then that happens in Latin America and it happens in Africa. So there is a lot of growth to be had. And we certainly see that happening, continuing to happen.
Yeah. So building off that, you mentioned before, you're like the heart of the internet in Northern Virginia. Mm-hmm. And how does that make sense? Because why would European internet traffic go to Virginia, or why would Asian internet traffic go to Virginia? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, in short, because it had to. There was not the same data center ecosystem that was built up in Europe or APAC or Africa. And so they had to kind of fly back to Northern Virginia to, there's a phrase, I think up until a couple of years ago, they said, Europe is served by Northern Virginia, or Europe is served by Ashburn. Now that's becoming less and less the case now as these countries and markets, grow and they develop their own. But Europe's an interesting one it's just as patchwork of different countries, and all those countries have different rules around data privacy and power usage and, permitting. So that actually probably benefits the operator, because instead of doing one deal in London to serve all of Europe, they're doing 5, one in London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Milan. But yeah, they're just because they had to. And again, I think maybe that stat about the percentage of traffic that goes through Ashburn will decrease as, the internet grows, so to speak, or matures overseas. But yeah, that was the reality, was that it just had to be. And Ashburn had like a 15-year head start on everybody else, just based on how it developed.
All right. So I want to talk about investing in, I guess, data centers and this trend of kind of more usage and more and just general growth of the internet. And obviously this is not financial advice, but if you just had to throw out some ideas, concepts of how people, whether regular people or like large corporations, would get exposure to the growth of data centers broadly, how would people do that?
Yeah. So the easiest answer would be, you can buy stock in these companies. Now, however, there's been a handful of pretty significant take private transactions over the last 3 years. So there's really only 3 publicly traded data center REITs that are left now. And so that opportunity to invest in those groups has shrunk a little bit. So there would be kind of one option. The other option, what we typically see is it's large institutional investors. And then there's a handful of very large cell towers, fiber providers, and data centers or telcos. And so they'll invest in those groups. So not being an expert in how that works, but those are the groups that are driving a lot of the growth. So it's the data center operators themselves who are, spending the money, partnering with, again, institutional investors or private funds to fund their growth. And it's expensive. One of the things we didn't talk about, but the cost to develop a data center is can be 5 to 10x, like an office building cost. And so the capital requirements are much higher in this space. So that's one thing that probably prevents the average. For example, I have a friend of mine who in Dallas will buy land and develop. It's just him and a few other guys, and they've got some capital partners. They can go buy land and develop an office building. And they can do that, successfully. I think that's harder to do in the data center space. And so you just don't see it as much where, kind of the onesie twosie developer, you see, it's the bigger groups that are having the more success. They've got the existing relationships with a handful of large customers. Those groups, they're working with those groups to figure out where they want to go, and then they're executing on it. So, one of the things that the rising interest rates has hurt the industry to some extent is that, again, harder to get the deals done. And so if you maybe quoted, again, we talked about this on our last podcast or 2 ago, if you quoted a deal in, October of 22 and it's now March, things have changed a lot since then. And so a lot of these deals are contingent on, financing being available at a certain rate. And so that's just an interesting wrinkle in this space, that it's getting a little bit harder to do, but you still see, again, very, very significant investment. That's the way we primarily see it done. Big institutions, private funds, and then obviously the publicly traded REITs.
Yeah. So what is the average cost of a data center? Are we talking like $10 million, or is it like 100 million or like $1 billion? Like what does it look like in America?
Yeah. So if you think about, a 30-acre site that you paid, let's say you had to pay $1 million an acre. So there's 30 million.
And is 30 acre the average? That seems like really large.
That's like a very average comp is a 30-acre site.
Okay.
And let's say you want to put a 30 megawatt data center on that. You're looking at about $10 million a megawatt. And that number is increasing just with supply chain, construction, labor, all those challenges. So you'd be 300 million for the building plus 30 million for the land. So you'd be 330. So
and the 330 is like the average.
Yeah. And that a 30 megawatt data center is probably a little bit smaller than is being developed, currently for the big customers. They're doing, 60, 90, 120 megawatt leases now. And so, but that's a very like middle of the road example. So 30 megawatt data center, which would be, 300,000 square feet ish, you'd be about 330 million bucks.
Wow.
So that's, and the majority of that money is spent, I think like around 60 to 70% is the generators, what are called the UPS systems, those batteries that kind of bridge the gap, the AC, all those air handlers, all that stuff that, you just don't have in a, office building or industrial building typically is driving a ton of that cost.
All right. So are there any technologies out there that you're aware of that are going to radically transform or have the potential to radically transform the data center industry as a whole?
Yeah, the one that is probably the most likely, and I can kind of tell you, is like liquid cooling. So normally how a data center works is you have a kind of stack of servers or a rack, and you see those sometimes in like IBM commercials, and they'll bring in like cold air will come up through the floor, and it'll get kind of sucked through, and they'll kind of set up their ducting in such a way that the cold air kind of goes through the thing and sucks up the top, and then it goes out, goes to the AC unit, gets recycled. Liquid cooling. So as the technology gets more advanced and you try and kind of pack more and more stuff into one server, they just generate more heat. And I think there's some actual like physical laws about number of computations equals a number of heat cast off. So as you're going to do more and more of that, you have to cool it more quickly. And the way to do that is with liquid cooling. So you basically dunk the server in like this a certain type of liquid that is circulated, and it can handle that higher processing power that generates all that more heat. So that's one, and it hasn't been like widely adopted because it's expensive, and there are some different challenges to implement it, and not everybody needs that high density deployment. So that's one. Other than that, there's not a ton of like earth shaking potential technological advancements. There's one I saw. It's almost humorous to say it, but it's the idea of storing data in DNA, and the stat that says if we could successfully store data in DNA and retrieve it, you could basically store the world's data in like a train car. Who knows if that'll ever come to pass? But there's groups who are working on different ways. It's really different ways to store data is really the key. And then, the cooling stuff. And a lot of that's like incremental changes. There's not like what we see as like groundbreaking developments happening there, but groups are working on it. And I think it'll continue to get incrementally better and better, especially as groups want to deploy some of the high density. It's going to have to be liquid cooled. But that doesn't change, the need. You still have to have the power to power the servers. You still have to cool that liquid that's cooling the servers. And so really what that means is you can get funds that are focused specifically on what they're called digital infrastructure. So what that is, you can get more, capacity in a smaller square footage. But as we've already talked about, the square footage is kind of the lowest part of the equation when it comes to cost. So even if all these things happen, you still have to put the power in, and you still have to cool it. So it's just and some of those are just, physical laws of nature. It's just hard to cool stuff and hard to power stuff.
Are there any topics that I missed that you think are very important that we touch upon?
No, I think we've done a good job. We've been pretty thorough, just understand again, the different types, how the industry has grown, where we see it growing in the future, investment in the space. Again, shameless plug, we've done, I think the conversation we have today is blown out across our podcast. If anything kind of piqued your interest, there's stuff there, but no, we've certainly done a great job covering it. Hopefully it was helpful for you and your listeners.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like I just did a, more than a college level course on everything data centers. It was extremely helpful. And before we jump off, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the metaverse? So of course I have to ask you, like, this is a metaverse podcast. Like, what are your general thoughts on the metaverse, and what does that even mean to you?
Yeah, I see the potential of it. I see the appeal of it. I've not spent a lot of time, and this is probably a reduction of the metaverse. I've not spent a lot of time with the VR headsets. Certainly not an amount of time that would lead me to be like, I have a really well-formed opinion on it. But I certainly see the appeal. And again, we see the impact of it as it impacts the data center space. So when Facebook ramped up a lot of their data center spending last year, at least in theory, to support metaverse, and then they've ramped that back down as kind of they've had some challenges with the metaverse. So we're kind of seeing the back end of it. But it's hard to imagine a world in maybe it's 10 or 20 or 50 years where augmented reality is not a really big part of what we do. And that's, my personal opinion. It's not really related to anything we do at Data Center Hawk, but it just seems like something that it seems like an inevitability. And again, that's my personal opinion, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Quite frankly, I'm a little bit worried because I think there'll be some unintended consequences. I worry about my kids and what their experience with that'll be like. If hypothetically you could go through life never meeting a physical person and only dealing with people virtually, that seems odd to say the least. But those are my thoughts. I'm really interested to see where it goes.
Amazing. Awesome. Mike, well, I appreciate you coming on. It was a blast, and I will hopefully talk to you very soon.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. Great to meet you as well.
See you.